You can find your local toy library on our website, which is toylibrary.co.nz. But the Federation is also run by volunteers, so if you've got a specific skill that you think could increase, the awareness of toy libraries or benefit toy libraries across the nation, then you can contact the Toy Library Federation of New Zealand's National Administrator at office@toylibrary.co.nz.
Lovely to have you on, Barbara. Thank you very much for that. That's Barbara Williman, co-president of the Toy Library Foundation. An alert: there's a new thing coming out. Forget about no butter on toast. They don't have butter in the US on their sandwich. James says, "Have you heard about the naked toast movement? Start spreading marmalade straight. It's the new thing, Liam, huh?" Zoe? No.
Sorry. I was gonna say, Liam, can I have my birthday off if I volunteer for the toy library?
Well, on that day,
All
yes,
right.
I suppose. That's
Good on you
both. That counts.
You've been fantastic, Liam here. Zoe George, I'm Wallace Chapman. Lisa Owen and Checkpoint next. Back tomorrow, 3:45. See you then.
Te whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Marie Owen. Haere aki nei, hold the line caller. National could be dialing up Winston Peters post-election, depending on how the numbers stack up. Former Prime Minister Sir John Key joins us live to navigate that tricky conversation. Waka Kotahi is racing to reopen the road through Haast Pass. The vital tourism route is buried under mud and rubble, and right now a 9-hour detour is the only alternative. We'll have the latest. RIP Aussie rugby's in peril as the Wallabies are bounced out of the World Cup. The resort town where workers are living in tents and cars because actual homes are in short supply, and pole geeks look lively. There's new numbers coming tonight. We'll have all the discussion.
RNZ News at 5 o'clock. Ahi Marie, good afternoon. I'm Evie Ashton. The New Zealand First Leader, Winston Peters, says voters will decide the shape of the next government, as National confirms it would do a deal if necessary. Christopher Luxon has refused for weeks to make a definitive statement either way about working with New Zealand First, but today said he would pick up the phone if it meant denying Labour the opportunity to govern again. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
While National is leading in the polls, depending on the election result, it could need support from New Zealand First to get over the line. In the past, Mr Peters has kept his options open, but ruled out Labour for 2023. No specific response from him to Chris Luxon's declaration delivered via social media, except to say it's now up to the voters. ACT leader David Seymour is focusing on the statement National would prefer a two-party coalition with his party, but acknowledges other options have to remain open.
National is accusing Labour of spreading misinformation in its climate manifesto announcement. Labour says that climate change is a growing economic and government credibility issue, and National would dial back everything that leads to meaningful greenhouse gas emissions. Here's political reporter Giles Dexter.
The Climate Manifesto lays out policies Labour would build on, such as more funding for green investment and a second emissions reduction plan. It would also establish a dedicated Minister for Just Transitions and remove diesel generators from schools. Labour says National hasn't announced a single policy which would reduce emissions, but National is pointing to its Electrify NZ policy, which would double the supply of renewable energy, aiming to decarbonise transport and industrial processes. The Greens have welcomed the manifesto announcement, but want it to go further and faster.
Bay of Plenty Emergency Management says its infrastructure is holding strong as heavy rain hits the region. Group Controller Cara Gordon says all of the region's roads are still open and any flooding has been minor. She says the rain will continue into the evening, but the situation is well under control.
So far, our river systems and our drainage systems have responded really well. There's been a bit of surface flooding and a few slips in the region, but nothing of major concern. Whilst we're still watching closely and ready to respond if anything does go wrong, if things continue as they are, we're feeling pretty positive about the progression.
Cara Gordon says the Regional Council ordered a controlled spill of the Matahina Dam to stop it from overflowing. Meanwhile, civil defence teams in Gisborne say the rain is easing, although it's expected to continue through until 11 o'clock tonight. Canterbury Regional Council is responding to an oil spill from a fishing vessel that ran aground on the south coast of Banks Peninsula. It says all 4 crew were recovered by helicopter last night. The fishing vessel, which is aground at Red Bluff, has about 10,000 litres of diesel and 400 litres of hydraulic oil on board. The Regional Council says oil is spilling towards Shell Bay, which is home to endangered wildlife. A crew member on a New Zealand yacht has died near Fiji. A broken mast killed the sailor and injured 2 other crew. The one survivor was rescued by a nearby Australian cruise ship this morning, and the other was picked up by the Fijian Navy later in the day. They're being taken to Fiji along with the sailor's body. And a South Island police officer has been caught on camera breathalyzing the passenger of a left-hand drive car before waving the vehicle through a checkpoint. TJ Woodrow says his American-made 1964 Chevrolet Impala was stopped 3 times at the weekend as he travelled to and from the Alexandra Blossom Festival with friends. He says his passenger was breath tested each time, but 2 other officers realised their mistake before releasing the car.
I think it's good when they get out and do checkpoints, but when there was 2 to 3 police that didn't notice, I thought that was pretty bad that, they get so much into like a trance, doing the same thing over and over again, repetitive, that they aren't doing the checks that they probably should be doing.
In sport, the Wallabies have all but been condemned to their earliest Rugby World Cup exit ever after a record 40-6 loss to Wales in Lyon. Wales are the first side to confirm a quarter-final spot, but it leaves 2-time champions Australia heading for a pool stage exit for the first time. Australia can only advance if Fiji lose to both Portugal and Georgia. Coach Eddie Jones has apologised for the performance and accepted the inexperience of the squad has counted against them.
The players, because they're young, they tend not to stick at it, and it's not because they don't care, and our effort just drops off a little bit. So, yeah, I'm not sure whether we can use experience as an excuse, but it's definitely part of our issue.
Meanwhile, Jones's future with the Wallabies is clouded, with reports linking him with a return to Japan after the World Cup. Jones is denying any such move. In today's other game, Scotland beat Tonga 45-17. Olympic champion and 2-time World Cup winner Megan Rapinoe has played her last international football match, helping the US beat South Africa 2-0 in Chicago. The 38-year-old's activism and off-field personality gave her an international profile. And mountain biker Anton Cooper has enjoyed the course for next year's Paris Olympic cross-country event after finishing second in a test event there. That's the news.
Winston Peters is ruled in by National.
If I need to pick up the phone to Mr. Peters, I will make that call.
There's outrage over slash damage in Queenstown.
The fact that they left the slash up there for 2 or 3 years and did nothing is an utter disgrace.
The capsule containing asteroid fragments lands safely on Earth.
Touchdown. I repeat, DDL. FRC has touchdown.
Uncharted Territory. Morning Report, weekdays from 6 on RNZ National.
And we're funded through New Zealand On Air. You're with Lisa Owen next on Checkpoint. Right now, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Tuesday. For Northland, isolated showers becoming widespread for a time tomorrow. Auckland to Taumaurinui and the Central High Country. Periods of rain turning to showers early tomorrow, then easing late. Coromandel, Bay of Plenty, Gisborne and Hawke's Bay. Rain with heavy falls, easing to isolated showers overnight. Some showers possibly heavy about Hawke's Bay tomorrow afternoon and evening with thunderstorms. Taranaki to Kapiti, scattered rain. Wellington and Waded Upper, showers turning to rain tomorrow and gale southerlies developing. Marlborough, North and Mid Canterbury. Mostly cloudy today with isolated showers, rain developing about Marlborough tomorrow morning, then spreading to Canterbury later. Nelson, Buller, Westland and Fiordland, also South Canterbury, Otago and Southland. Mostly fine, apart from areas of low cloud in Southland tomorrow morning. Scattered rain developing about Nelson tomorrow evening. And for Chatham Islands, rain developing this evening. It is 7 minutes past 5. I'll have traffic news and headlines for you at 20 past 5.
Nā mihi iwi, tēnā koutou katoa, no mai, haere mai, ki checkpoint I tēnei rā, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. Well, it's official. National leader Chris Luxon would pick up the phone to Winston Peters if he needs to. He might just need to find his number first. After weeks of dismissing questions about working with New Zealand First as hypothetical, Mr Luxon has confirmed via a social media video a working relationship could be on the cards. Recent polls show National with a lead over Labour, but it's not a straightforward path to power. In some scenarios, they need the support of both ACT and New Zealand First to form a government. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
To govern a country, you need experience. And this is not our first rodeo.
The political warhorse is now officially in the running alongside National and its preferred partner, ACT.
My strong preference is to form a strong and stable two-party coalition government between National and ACT. I believe that government...
National leader Chris Luxon confirming he would seek the support of New Zealand First if needed.
If New Zealand First is returned to Parliament and I need to pick up the phone to Mr Peters to keep Labour and the coalition of chaos out, I will make that call.
And this is different positioning from Mr Peters. In past elections, he's kept National and Labour both on the table.
In the end, the voters of this country, dare I say it, that's the reason why we're backing the rules everywhere, will decide this issue, not politicians, and most certainly not the media.
But in 2023, he continues to rule out any kind of support for Labour.
No, I'm not going to go down the pathway of racism and division and separatism.
Chris Luxon was out and about in Matamata today, fielding more questions about this morning's announcement.
It's not my preference, but my choice is actually if it's another 3 years of this malarkey, which the country cannot afford or tolerate, then I will pick up the phone to Mr Peters.
He says they've had a bit to do with each other over the years.
We've caught up for the odd drink over the number of the last few years from time to time. That's about it.
Do you have his phone number?
I'm not sure.
RNZ asked these voters in Matamata for their thoughts.
I don't think we need him. I think he's too disruptive.
I don't mind Winston. As I say, I think he's probably a very, what I call a true politician.
They will keep each other at a certain, to account. That is always good, I believe.
Labour leader Chris Hipkins reiterates his position of not working with New Zealand First on principle, having first been ruled out by Winston Peters, predicting trouble on the other side.
It will be a recipe for instability. It will be bad for New Zealand's economy. It will be bad for the country overall. Ultimately, voters are going to make that decision.
ACT is in a scrap for votes with New Zealand First, with leader David Seymour playing up the positive.
The strong preference is that we want to have an ACT national coalition.
Not so keen to talk about a potential political bedfellow.
I always keep the options open, and I'm aware of that there's various parties that are trying to get into Parliament and may succeed or may fail.
It's shaping up to be another big week in the campaign. Newshub has another opinion poll out tonight and then a leaders' debate on Wednesday. National and Labour are also promising to release their full fiscal plans ahead of the start of early voting on Monday.
And that's our political editor, Jane Patterson. And we'll be speaking to former Prime Minister Sir John Key shortly about Christopher Luxon's strategy when it comes to New Zealand First. It is almost 12 minutes after 5. Kia mau tonu mai. Do stay with us. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. We're all gutted that from Wallabies coach Eddie Jones, his team's effectively been bundled out of the Rugby World Cup after a record loss to Wales. The Wallabies were trounced 46 in Lyon, suffering their worst defeat at a Rugby World Cup. It means they've missed the knockout stages of the tournament for the first time, unless Fiji loses to either Georgia or Portugal. Christy Doran is a rugby editor for leading Australian sports website The Roar. He sums up the Wallabies' performance.
It's a complete disaster from an Australian rugby perspective for a national union that is desperate for more funds, for more broadcasting viewership, for more sponsorships. to bow out before the quarterfinal stage, not even make it out of the pool for the first time in the tournament's 10 tournament history. It's a complete disaster, and it sums up exactly where Australian rugby is at.
Who is responsible for this?
Look, the easy and the simple answer is both Eddie Jones, who made some bold, daring decisions to farewell a generation of players, including Michael Hooper, the Wallabies' most capped captain, Quade Cooper, Bernard Foley, other experienced players, some quality young players like Len Ikatau to back, generally speaking, go all in on youth. Hamish McLennan, the Rugby Australia chairman, of course, parachuted him in for Dave Rennie. They're the two simplistic answers. In reality, probably the Rugby Australia administration of the last 2 decades is at fault here for this moment in time. The lack of investment, the lack of investment in grassroots, the lack of understanding about what are the priorities and where the money should be allocated to inspiring the next generation, that's been a complete absence for 2 decades, and the chickens have come home to roost.
Eddie Jones can be quite combative. Did he do a mea culpa afterwards?
Hard to be combative following tonight's result, 40 points to 6, where only 2 penalty goals from Ben Donaldson were the sole contributions for Australia tonight. He was both apologetic, both on the ground itself in Lyon, but also in the press conference afterwards, unreservedly apologised. But he didn't go away from what he believed was a necessary usherance of the next generation, where Eddie, and I've had this on good authority, certainly has now been fully made aware of the difficult task of coming back and seeing it and observing it, but now experiencing it and being in the coalface. He didn't necessarily sign up for this in terms of what he thought. He was encouraged not to take the role. He took it despite perhaps the better judgment of some of his peers that he respects and listens to. But he wouldn't. He certainly didn't say that he regretted some of the brutal selection decisions that he made.
So did he have his eyes on the prize? Because, there's reports of him doing a job interview with Japan during this campaign.
Yeah, and I think those reports are right. And whether or not they were a backup plan, history suggests that the Australian Rugby Board and now the Rugby Australia Board don't allow for mediocrity, and that's what we've seen on the scoreboard and on the pitch over the last couple of weeks, and indeed the last couple of months. You can, to an extent, understand why Eddie Jones would be keeping other irons in the fire, but it's an embarrassing look for the game. It's terrible optics, and you kind of got to ask the question: well, if Eddie was already looking for the abort parachute, what kind of mindset, what's the psychology for his team when he's telling them we're all about the future, yet are you actually going to be part of the future, and do you want to be part of the future?
Well, if Australia Rugby doesn't tolerate mediocrity, does the whole board there need to go?
There will be some serious heat, but once again, is this a current board problem? Like, they've gone in for a guy that, yes, I know he got fired by the RFU, but he had the 73% winning record with England, the greatest and the highest ever, even surpassing Clive Woodward, who of course beat Eddie Jones in 2003 in the World Cup final. I think there will be some serious questions. I think the wider federal kind of model, which allows for a board to be overthrown, I think there's every chance that might occur if significant action isn't taken over the coming weeks.
And that's Christy Doran there. Waka Kotahi is working to partially reopen Haast Pass, a critical road link between the West Coast and Otago that's been closed since Thursday's storms, meaning a 9-hour detour to get to Queenstown. Muddy Creek Bridge on State Highway 6 north of Makarora has been swamped in a slip, leaving the bridge and road buried in about 20,000 cubic metres of debris. The slip is piled about 4 metres high at the bridge and water is flowing over the mound. The road is vital for tourists and locals, and travellers coming from the likes of Haast, Fox Glacier and Franz Joseph now have a 9-hour plus trip to Queenstown via Haast Pass, and remember, it's the school holidays. But Waka Kotahi is working to partially reopen the road to limited traffic. Well, joining us now is its systems manager, Robert Chauvet. Robert, how are you?
Kia ora, Lisa. Good, thank you.
What is the goal here?
Well, the goal is obviously to restore access to the highway to get coast to coast back open again. It's the number one priority. We understand that it's a critical highway for the people of the region, and we're applying all of the resources that we can at our disposal to make sure that this gets open.
But realistically, the first step is one lane, is it?
Absolutely. As part of that, recognising the criticality of this highway, we've worked with the contractors to find a medium to be able to get through and set convoys at set times to allow the crews to have all the safety and the access that they need to get it clear, but also to keep access to the West Coast.
So when's that going to happen, Robert, and at what times? What are the details?
So, tomorrow for the first day, because we've just had our structural engineers check and have a quick look. They'll be going back again in the morning just to have a look at a few other things. 12 p.m. Will be the first round tomorrow, starting at the Lake Hawea side, letting that side through first, and then once convoy reaches the other side, they'll turn around and let the West Coast side through, and then again at 4:30 p.m. tomorrow, weather permitting and conditions permitting.
What kind of vehicles?
Light vehicles only at this stage. We've had some good reports back from the structural engineers, so hopefully that good news continues and then we can open it to the existing conditions for that highway.
Okay, so what counts as a light vehicle? Or camper vans? What about milk tankers and delivery trucks?
No, well, milk tankers and delivery trucks, that road is only open to 50 max, so our freight freight customers understand the difference between a 50 max and a HPMV, but at this stage we're just keeping it open to anything from a camper van down.
And those are guided convoys, are they?
Yep, so we'll have a front and rear pilot led by our contractors who will guide them all the way through, as I say, turn around and do the same thing on the way back.
Okay, so that's 2 passages tomorrow. What is your intention after that?
So intention after that is to continue with the escorted convoys, although we'll open up a third one in the morning starting at 8 a.m. So it'll be 8 a.m, 12 p.m. and 4:30 p.m. That will have 3 escorted convoys running until such point as we can open it back up safely to 2 lanes again.
So tell me about the work that is happening there. How much have you got to clear away and how long do you think it's going to take?
Oh, look, it's been a long 5 days for our crews. As you mentioned, 20,000 cubes on material 3 to 4 metres high, and it's with that amount of material packing down, and it's gone off like concrete. So the good thing is that by today or early tomorrow morning, they should have punched a way through, allowing for at least 1 lane of traffic to get through. But there's a long road ahead in terms of the recovery afterwards and dealing with the Muddy Creek itself, with the grading. And we're working with ORC and DOC on that response. So
you're talking about weeks or months, Robert, to restore it properly?
Oh, look, until we have a good understanding of the full situation, this is, about a 2-kilometre creek which runs all the way up into the hills, understanding how much material is actually there, the size of it, how it's going to be mobilised. We won't know until that stage, but once we've got all of that information in hand and we've worked with ORC on what their side of the response is, because we obviously just deal with either side of the highway there, but we will be there in support as they need it.
So where has all this junk and debris come from?
It's just come from the hills. So we've got some very, very steep mountain ranges through there, and this is quite common for this stretch of road. We have multiple creeks through the area. You just get a bit of a slip up in the hills, and then a bit of rain mobilises that material, and depending on the size of the material, it either travels far or it just dumps right where it lands.
Could there be anything that could have been done before the bad weather set in to avoid this happening?
Not really. We do all we can to find the known knowns and keep track of those. We have obviously weather reports that come through, but until this material mobilises off of the slopes, we don't know.
Appreciate your time this evening. That is Robert Chavot, who is from Waka Kotahi, Systems Manager there, trying to get State Highway 6 open again through Haast Pass. They are hoping to be able to open one lane tomorrow, escorted convoys from midday, 22 minutes after 5, and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Homai o whakaaro, we would love your feedback on anything you've heard on the program this evening. Do get in touch. Let us know your thoughts about Christopher Luxon saying he'll call Winston Peters if he needs to form a government after October the 14th. Also, if you're affected by the closure of State Highway 6 through Haast Pass, let us know what effect that's having on you. 2101 on text. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, and the email address is checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Time to go to the headlines now. Ko Evi anō tēnei.
National says it would work with New Zealand First if it had to after the election, but would prefer a partnership with ACT. Labour says there's no scenario in which it would work with New Zealand First. Winston Peters says voters will have the final say. Waka Kotahi is planning to partially reopen the storm-hit Haast Pass between the West Coast and Otago to light vehicles tomorrow. A slip 5 days ago dumped about 20,000 cubic metres of debris at Muddy Creek Bridge on State Highway 6 north of Makarora. Waka Kotahi's system manager, Robert Chavot, told Checkpoint there'll be one lane escorted crossings at 12 p.m. and 4:30 p.m. Queenstown Lakes District Council says water tankers are providing safe drinking water while the local supply is under a boil water notice. It's been a week since the precautionary notice was issued because of a gastro-illness outbreak stemming from the Cryptosporidium parasite. There have been 31 confirmed cases so far, and the source is still under investigation. Civil defence teams in Gisborne say the rain is easing, although an orange heavy rain warning remains in place for the area north of Gisborne until 11 o'clock tonight. A further 150 millimetres of rain is expected at most, on top of the more than 200 millimetres accumulated in the past 24 hours. And soldiers are being put on standby in London after dozens of Metropolitan Firearms officers handed back their weapons permits. The officers fear possible future prosecution after one officer was charged with the murder of an unarmed man. Those are the headlines. Looking at traffic in the Waikato, State Highway 3 at Te Awamutu, there are reports of a breakdown blocking the road by the roundabout that intersects with Arawata Street, and State Highway 35 is closed at Omaio between Omaio Pa Road and Wharawhara Road due to a slip, and of course State Highway 6 remains closed at the Haast Pass. Our next traffic news and headlines are at 20 to 6.
Ngā mihi, Evie. Wales became the first team to lock in a Rugby World Cup quarter-final spot after humiliating Australia in Lyon. The 46 record victory means Wales are undefeated after 3 matches at the tournament. Wales are now celebrating a 4th consecutive World Cup quarter-final qualification. We are joined by sports reporter Felicity Reid. OK, so there is a few Kiwi connections to this big win, Felicity.
There are. A couple of New Zealanders were key cogs today. So first 5, Gareth Anscombe, he had a man-of-the-match performance with 23 points. Probably got a bit more game time than he was expecting today, though. He came off the bench in the 12th minute as an injury replacement for Dan Biggar. Dan Biggar picked up a pec strain in a tackle, but Anscombe's had his own injury or litany of injury woes, actually, so you can probably empathise with the way that Biggar's feeling in this situation. Leading up to this tournament, Anscombe broke his hand, and there was a point where they thought that the Blues and Chiefs player wasn't actually even going to make the World Cup, which I think probably gave him flashbacks to 2019 when he had a knee injury that ruled him out of that World Cup in Japan. So he's been on the sidelines even more recently with a shoulder injury that put him out for 5 months. So shoulder, hand, and then was sitting on the bench, and then thought today he realised he was quite underdone coming into this tournament, but this was an opportunity for him, and he showed up when it mattered. He admitted that the sharpness was actually coming back today, so that's probably a good sign for Wales. If Dan Biggar could be out for up to 2 weeks, So there is potential there to give Anscombe some more game time. Another New Zealander who's picking up the plaudits is coach Warren Gatland. So this is Gatland's second stint with Wales. He's come back, and when he first came back, there was some losses. There was a potential player boycott over contracts. But the BBC wrote that this must have been one of Wales' finest performances under the New Zealander. So despite this not easy lead up to the World Cup, I mean, Gatland has returned after spending the last 3 years involved in Super Rugby in New Zealand. And here's his take on the state of Australian rugby.
There's definitely a dominance of the New Zealand teams in terms of that competition, but Wales isn't really much different to Australia. We've got regional teams that need to step up and perform and get better, and I think the same thing is for the Super Rugby sides in Australia as well. And so if you can get performances, results, get to quarterfinals, semi-finals, finals, then that has a huge positive impact on the national team in terms of players coming in with a bit of a spring in their step and confidence.
So there are 13 days before Wales' next game against Georgia. So Warren Gatland's given the players a few days off to sort of rejuvenate, and especially, I guess, once you've got the quarterfinal locked in, you can probably afford to do that.
And the Silver Ferns will also need to shake off a shock loss of their own this week.
This one falls into the embarrassing category after New Zealand netball called out England for sending what they were describing as a second-string side, devoid of any of their World Cup players, and then the Silver Ferns couldn't even beat them. So that was last night in Christchurch, a 1-goal loss to the England side. And they were quite critical. I mean, disrespectful was the word thrown around by Netball New Zealand before England arrived here. So maybe they might be eating the words a little bit. And it takes it back to 4 straight losses for the Silver Ferns, and that goes back to the World Cup. So out on court last night, England had 56 test cap players compared to 412 for the Silver Ferns, but it was the visitors actually showing up, the local girls there. And coach Dame Nolene Taurua is not making any excuses, but does say she has no magic bullet. The players she's got are the players she's got. They're the best available in New Zealand, that we have to support them. She says a lack of ruthlessness, competitive edge and hardness is something that they don't have at the moment. But actually, they're not going to have very long to find that, because Game 2 is in Porirua on Wednesday.
Thank you, Felicity. Felicity Reid there with sport. To the UK now, where the Army has been asked to provide backup after a large number of Met police downed their weapons in protest of a colleague being charged with murder. The incident happened in South London last year when the police officer shot and killed an unarmed man. The Met Commissioner has called for a reform of the way police officers are held to account. The BBC's Ali Price reports.
You'd only expect to see the Army on the streets of London after a terror attack. But following the decision of more than 100 Met police officers to hand in their permit to carry a firearm, military personnel are on standby in case of an emergency. Earlier, Suella Braverman called for a review into armed policing. Her intervention was welcomed by the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley. In a letter, he said improvements at the Met Police were being undermined by a system not set up to help officers succeed, identifying police pursuits and the use of force as areas of the most glaring unfairness. He said officers need sufficient legal protection to do their job and keep the public safe. A former officer agreed.
I was on armed response for 23 years. I was on VIP protection, and I hugely enjoyed the professionalism, the teamwork of it, and I would miss that. Would I put my weapon down today? Yes, I would hand it in. It's not worth it.
It all comes after a Met police officer was charged on Thursday with the murder of unarmed Chris Cabba last year. He was fatally shot while in a borrowed car in South London, a car the police say was linked to an incident involving a gun. The Met Police has been keen to stress tonight that military personnel will not be involved in armed patrols across the streets of London. That work will be done by police officers, the majority of which I'm told will be from the Met, though their numbers will be bulked out with officers from other forces from across the country. It's understood, though, that some officers from those other forces have refused to work in the capital in solidarity with their Met colleagues. The Home Secretary said she ordered the review to ensure armed officers have the confidence to do their job. The big question is whether that instills confidence in the communities they serve.
That report from the BBC, 29 minutes away from 6. Kia amo tonu mai. Do stay with us. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. It's time for the business news now. Ko taku hoa e nai ko Nona Peltier. Nona joins me in the studio. OK, Nona, there's been a rise in deposit rates for savers. What details have you got for us?
Well, Westpac and Kiwibank have raised some of their rates to match the rate of inflation. Well, we've waited a while for this, haven't we? Yes, Westpac is one of the first to offer 6% on your deposits. That's your savings, right? For terms that are under 12 months long. And also up to its 9-month term as well. So, Westpac and Kiwibank have...
both offering the same rate? No, is that what you're saying?
Kiwibank is going a little bit better, 6.05. So they're leading the march there. But let's hope that more do the same, because that's one of the things that I think, a number of people have pointed out, is that the deposit rates have not really kept up, have they?
Okay, this next story, a Kaniwi coin. You'll be able to tell us what that is.
Like
a Kaniwi sells for $60,000. What is this coin, please, and why is it worth so much?
Well, it was struck at a Canadian mint, and it ended up, you can see here on the screen, it's a 1985 coin, and it's got, on one side, it's got the Canadian, it's got like a canoe there and some voyageurs, and on the back side, it's got the Queen.
So it was a mistake, was it?
Yes, it was. It's a mistake, but also a very valuable one. $60,000 this coin went for in an auction on Friday. And that's the highest price ever paid.
So they basically pressed, for people who are listening, they basically pressed one side of the coin with what would be on a Canadian coin, and the other side of the coin was pressed with
New Zealand
money.
And it ended up here in New Zealand or somewhere, and I guess someone found it out on the back of their couch, or I don't know exactly where.
Can you imagine?
A 1985 coin worth $60,000. Now, go check around your house. If you have it there, it's lucky for you, because only 11 of them made their way into circulation, apparently. And it was the record for a Kiwi coin sold in New Zealand. That's a record price. And it was a lot more than they thought they would get. It was 7 times the pre-auction estimate. So there you go. Some coins that are Canadian Kiwi coins are worth more than just the regular kind.
And what can you tell us about the markets, please, Nona?
Okay, so the market rose 4.5 points only to 11,377. The dollar was trading a little bit higher, just a touch, 59.4 US cents, 92.6 Australian, and 48.6 British pence. But look, there's still a lot of worry out there. Shares in Asia dropped today, and that was mostly because people are still concerned about the economy in China as well. There is central banks around the world are talking about keeping interest rates higher for longer, which of course normally isn't a very good news for the market, but for ours today, we rose 4.5 points. So there you go.
Thank you, Nona. Ka kite. Nona Peltier there with Business News. Ring, ring. Hello, is that you, Winston? Christopher Luxon calling. Well, that's exactly the scenario painted by the National leader, who sent smoke signals to voters via social media this morning. It's crunch time, he says, and if he's forced to, he will ring the New Zealand First Leader to form a government if National and ACT don't have the votes for his preferred two-party coalition post-election. Recent polls have New Zealand First cracking the 5% threshold needed to get back into Parliament. To date, the National leader's been a bit coy about whether he's prepared to do a deal with Winston Peters. But now Christopher Luxon couldn't be more explicit.
If New Zealand First is returned to Parliament and I need to pick up the phone to Mr Peters to keep Labour and the coalition of chaos out, I will make that call. And frankly, I think Chris Hipkins will ultimately do exactly the same thing. That's not my first preference. We all remember 2017. New Zealand First hasn't gone with National in 27 years and could choose Labour again. But that decision is ultimately up to you.
So, what is going on here? Former Prime Minister and National Party leader Sir John Key point blank ruled Winston Peters out as a coalition partner at 2 elections. And Sir John joins us now. Kia ora, Sir John.
Kia ora.
What's the strategy here, do you reckon?
Oh, pretty simple one, I think. The simple reality is you need 61 votes to form a government. And, we just don't know. I don't think anybody really knows how those numbers play out on election night. And but what I do know is a couple of things. I mean, the first of them is that, you look at every election on who's in and who's out on a case-by-case basis. So in my time, we absolutely not only ruled the Maori Party in, but actually when we didn't need them, we still put them as part of the governing relations. This time, Chris has ruled Te Pāti Māori out. So, it does vary by election. And the second thing is there's a very high expectation from New Zealanders that if you have the largest majority, not necessarily enough to form a government per se, then you'll do everything you can to put together a government that stops the voters going back and having to have another election. So it really is just a race to 61 seats, I hate to say it.
It's a warning shot, isn't it? It's a warning from Christopher Luxon to voters who might be swing voters or might not be solid national supporters, that unless you deal him the hand that he can work with ACT and National, he's going to have to go shopping elsewhere.
Yeah, well, look, I think he's absolutely saying that this is a change election, and if you want the country heading in a different direction when it comes to law and order and the economy and health and education, then you need to vote to change. And the best way to make that happen is for a strong National Party. Now, in his perfect world, and I live in that world as well, that would be 51%. But I think, do any of us think National's going to poll 51% on election night? Probably not. On that basis, then you under MMP, you say, how do I cobble together a coalition? And he then made it really clear his by far strongest preference is a two-way coalition, which includes himself and the ACT Party. And I think that's exactly where David Seymour sees things as well. But the problem you've got is what happens if you get to, say, in your National Act and you get to 58 votes and, for an argument, Labour are at 56 votes and Winston holds the balance at 6 votes. I mean, if you've ruled them out in the way that Chris Hipkins has, and you've told the public, I will not deal with them, which is exactly my position in 2008. I would not have Winston. I would assume that Chris Hipkins is a man of his word and won't ring. Well, then how do you form a government? It's got to be a minority government on that basis, and the minority government can be dragged down by a party voting against you at any particular time. So I think it's just a practical approach to say, I'm going to be honest with people. I don't want to do this, but if I have to do it, I will.
The alternative is that you say you won't go with Winston Peters and therefore you force voters' hands if they want to change. They've got an option of voting for two parties who are prepared to work together, because that's what you did in 2008 and 2011, because you said, and these are your words, you didn't want to be involved in a soap opera with Winston Peters and you thought he was a rearward-looking politician. So I'm thinking, has Winston Peters changed? Do you think he's changed?
Well, what I'd say to you is I don't make the calls. I mean, I'm not the leader of the National Party. I'm not in government anymore.
No, but as a seasoned politician, Sir John, as a seasoned politician, observing from the sidelines, you had your concerns about Winston Peters, and I'm wondering if you think, as a political operator, Winston Peters has materially changed in his approach from when you wouldn't deal with him.
Well, I don't know, but what I can tell you is this, is that having had Labour rule him out, and let's just take Chris Hipkins at his word, because that's certainly where I was, wouldn't have made the phone call. If I was advising Christopher Luxon today about what he should do, I would advise him to rule Winston in under the conditions he's done. And the reason for that is that, fundamentally, if you got to election Sunday, the day after the election, and the only alternative was another election because no one would ring Winston, I think the public would be pretty grumpy. I think they'd say, look, and this is the problem. Is
it an attempt to scare voters and shore up their votes?
No, I think it's an attempt to be honest, if I'm really frank. I mean, because the one thing I would say is if you're Christopher Luxon and you rule Winston out because your preferred option is ACT and National, we get all that, but you rule them out, and the public return him with over 5% to Parliament, or he wins a seat, right? And he's a player in the contest, if you like. If the very first thing you do is say, well, no one can form a government and we don't want to have a minority government because they're inherently unstable, so therefore I will ring him, the very first thing you've done
your
as an
logic, Sir
incoming
John,
Prime
and I'm
Minister
sorry
is lie to the public, I think.
Yeah, I do get your logic as you present it there, but the flip side of that coin is that Christopher Luxon has just given Winston Peters more oxygen. Do you accept that as the alternative as well?
Not sure, really. I mean, yes and no. I mean, to a degree...
You just made him relevant.
He certainly made it... Well, yeah, the problem with that strategy, because like if it was as simple as ruling someone out and therefore they weren't relevant, that would be easy. But the problem you've got is that just because you rule them out doesn't mean that 5% of people don't vote for them. And, you know, at the moment, what happens is when you get a time where the big political parties aren't polling really big numbers, right? So typically in elections in New Zealand, National and Labour polled around about 80%. There's always 20% going somewhere else, whether it was social credit or values or somewhere else. And in more recent times, a lot more players. But when one of the parties gets low and you've got Labour under 30 consistently, the problem that you've got, and not National credibly much above 40 if they are, the problem you've got is you've got a lot of vote splitting happening, and I don't think anyone can rule out that Winston doesn't get 5%. Now, he might get 4.5%, he might get 6.5%, I don't really know. But he is there a chance he's a player? I think there's a chance.
Okay, so there's some things, because we're running out of time, it would be great to get some quick answers too. Are you advising Christopher Luxon, and did you advise him on this decision?
Well, I talked to Christopher because we're friends, and I would certainly say to him, if he directly asked me that question, I'd say rule him in.
Did he directly ask you that question, and did you directly give him that advice?
Oh, well, look, over the last 6 months we had endless conversations.
Come on, Sir John.
And they move around quite a bit. But put it this way, I can count to 61, and it is, whether you like it or not, politics is an ugly business sometimes.
I'll take that as a yes then, right? Okay, so how much of this is about managing expectations, letting them know that they're not the only option in town?
Very little, I think. I mean, if National and ACT can form a majority government, the two together, that'll be where they'll go.
Why not talk to the Māori Party? You did. You
have to accept this comment as me being a bit out of it now, but I just think the Māori Party are quite a different beast today as they were in my day. I mean, Tariana and Peter were great operators, very good people to deal with, very pragmatic, did some wonderful things for their people. I think this current Te Pāti Māori is a little bit different. I think they don't really want to, first I don't think they want to be with National, and I just don't think they want to be part of that mainstream kind of thinking. That's just my read from the sidelines.
You think National can work with Winston Peters?
Well, you've got to remember, working with can be lots of different ways, can't it? I mean, what happens if Winston becomes the Speaker? In which case, they're not actually technically in government, are they? Well, they sort of are.
Are you giving that advice to Christopher Luxon?
Well, I'm just saying MMP requires a lot of creative thinking, but let's say Winston was the Speaker, then you only need 60 votes, not 61. And, maybe that's the solution. I don't know. All I'm saying to you is the trouble you have with MMP is it's a beautiful thing to say, here's the outcome. And on that Saturday night or on that Sunday, we'll all be able to opine on that. But as it stands today, I can't make you a guarantee that Winston's there or not there. If he is there, I can give you some ideas of how you might want to work, and if he's not there, I could give you some ideas. But the simple facts of life are none of us are fortune tellers.
Okay, so ideas on how it would work. Could you have both ACT and New Zealand First in Cabinet? Could you make that work?
Maybe, but I heard David Seymour on the radio this morning saying, he didn't say absolutely no, but he said, look, it's pretty difficult, and I think he's been quite consistent in that. But again, who knows what particular parties want? I mean, I'm not part of that, and, I wasn't in 2017, for instance, when there was somewhat of a beauty parade. I mean, I'm just working on the principle. I mean, Chris, Luxon said, well, I think Chris Hipkins would make the call even though he's ruled him out. I would say if he did, that would be a terrible way to start a government, to basically have lied to the New Zealand public, unless you're an outright liar. So if he's not an outright liar, then he would do what I would have done, which is in 2008, I made it really clear to Bill and English and Stephen Joyce and everyone that was in the tight group, if you like, I am not ringing Winston. That's what I told them before I made that call to rule him out.
We got to go, Sir John. I want a one-word answer. Can you trust Winston Peters? Yes or no, please?
Hope so.
Thanks for your time. It's good to talk to you. That is Sir John Key, former Prime Minister there, speaking about Christopher Luxon's decision to say he'd go with Winston if he needs to. It is 14 minutes away from 6 and you with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Homai or whakaaro, interested in your thoughts on that one. Sir John Key says it's a pragmatic decision to open the door to Winston Peters. Text us on 2101 with your thoughts. Tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. Email address checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Evie is patiently waiting with the headlines. Ko Evie anō tēnei.
Florence Waititi, the mother of Te Pāti Māori co-leader Dawiri Waititi, has died. Mr Waititi's fellow co-leader, Debbie Ngāriwapaka, says Whaia Flow contributed to Te Pāti Māori's views and was staunch to the movement. A Russian overnight missile and drone attack in southern Ukraine has injured one woman and damaged port infrastructure in the city of Odessa. The scale of the attack and the full extent of the damage aren't yet known. And the Writers Guild of America says it's reached a tentative labour agreement with major TV and film studios, potentially ending one of two strikes that have crippled Hollywood. The 3-year contract must be approved by the Guild's 11,500 film and television members. However, the cameras can't roll again just yet as the Actors Union remains on strike. Those are the headlines. Looking at traffic, a quick whiz around on the Waikato. There are reports of a breakdown blocking the road State Highway 3 at Te Awamutu by the roundabout that intersects with Arawata Street. State Highway 35 is closed at Omaio between Omaio Pa Road and Wharewhara Road because of a slip. State Highway 36 north of Rotorua, there's reports of a crash there, partially blocking the northbound lane. And State Highway 6 Haast to Makarora is still closed because of a slip, weather permitting, and subject to confirmation following an assessment tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. 2 escorted convoys for light vehicles only will be run tomorrow at midday and 4:30. Our next news and weather is at 6.
Evie speeding down the metaphorical highway there with the traffic updates. OK, to Queenstown now. Queenstown hospitality venues are finding ways to deal with the boil water notice as tourists stream in for the school holidays. There have now been 31 confirmed cases of Cryptosporidium gastrobug among residents and visitors to the town in the last month. The local health boss has admitted there'll be more that haven't been reported. Meanwhile, the adult hot pool at Alpine Aqualand in Frankton has been closed while staff review its filtration system. The facility's other pools remain open. However, children under 8, pregnant women and immunocompromised people are advised to keep out of the pools for now. Despite all of that, businesses and tourists are making sure the boil water notice doesn't get in the way of people having a good holiday. Neva Chittick reports from Queenstown.
Queenstown looks picture perfect today. Snow-capped mountains, a clear sky, bustling town centre and a glassy blue lake. But there might be something in the water, Cryptosporidium to be exact. It's a tourist town and the school holidays are underway. These visitors are taking it all in their stride.
We were a little bit worried having a 10-month-old, but we'll just, use our bottled water, and then if we need to use anything else, we'll just, obviously have to boil water, but hopefully it's not too much of an issue.
We've been boiling our water for like coffee and tea. As of right now, we haven't felt sick or anything. Drinking a lot of bottled water.
I mean, it's a bit inconvenient sometimes because it would be nice to just fill up our water bottles out of the faucet, but we're used to it. We're from Houston, Texas, and we normally don't drink out of the faucet, so I mean, given a place like Queenstown, we would have expected it would have been fine.
Te Whatu Ora Southern has confirmed 31 cases of gastro illness caused by the parasite, one more than yesterday's figures. The source of the outbreak is still not known, with teams working around the clock to try track it down. Medical Officer of Health Dr Susan Jack says a few of the cases are visitors from outside Queenstown.
We are strongly urging anyone who's been in Queenstown who has diarrhoea, abdominal pain symptoms to call their GP or go to Queenstown Medical Centre if they don't have a GP to organise testing. The more cases that we can get and interview, the more chance we've got of trying to find out what the source is.
Mayor Glenn Lewis says so far water test results from central venues have come back clear, but cryptosporidium is far from straightforward to find.
When we test between the business and the network interface, and if we see a residual chlorine drop, that might be an indication that we might be getting some cross-contamination from other sources outside of our networks. The added complication is if there's a carbon filter between our network and the private network we're testing, because carbon reacts with the residual chlorine.
Darrell Jenkins, Senior Regional Manager for Hospitality New Zealand, says some members have been getting crafty to keep customers safe.
We've had some members hook up their coffee machines to jerry cans. We've had some members utilise the ice that they can't put in drinks to keep bottles of drinks cool. You just adapt and get on with it, and there's plenty more things to come to Queenstown for than tap water.
So how long will it be until the jerry can is back to being filled with petrol? Glenn Lewis says plans for a protozoa detection barrier to be added to the 2 Mile water treatment plant were due to be finished in the next few days.
Talking with suppliers, best case is probably 7 to 8 weeks. Worst case is it's just a little bit longer than that. We'll probably have a better idea of it come the end of this week.
Until then, bagged ice is clinking in the cocktails, tankers have safe water on tap, and word on the street is bottled tastes better than boiled.
It is 8 minutes away from 6. Kia mau tonu mai. Do stay with us. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. Pacific candidates from Labour, National Act and the Greens have locked horns over immigration, education and crime today. Spokespeople from the 4 parties have debated the issues at the RNZ Pacific and Pacific Media Network election debate. Our Election 2023 Pacific Issues reporter Lydia Lewis reports.
Tension.
I think we need to be a bit more honest around that as well.
Could I have been honest,
well, there's
Karen?
all these
tears.
The one that upsets me the most is 14.2% of our Year 8 students, this was tested in 2022, reach the minimum curriculum for maths. And the general number was actually 41.5.
And big promises, one from a party that had the power to make changes just a few weeks ago.
You have to think about everything that has been expected of Immigration New Zealand in the last couple of years and the immense pressure that they have been under.
The Dawn Raid's apology was 2 years ago, and now Labour's Pacific spokesperson Carmel Sepuloni says it can implement an amnesty in 100 days if re-elected. The Greens' Tiano Tuiono is baffled as to why they didn't roll it out when they had the chance.
An amnesty for overstays is more than timely, it's late.
Both ACT and National do not support an amnesty. When it came to health, the eye rolls started. ACT's Karen Chaw was adamant on one thing.
It shouldn't be based on ethnicity, it should be based on need.
The Greens don't agree with that one.
If you've got bi-Pacific, full Pacific health providers, that's good for our people, because some of our people, they won't go down there if that person doesn't speak their language.
And National's Whanoti Agnes Loheni dug herself into a bit of a hole.
We don't disagree on outreach. That's different. In fact, we support a lot of outreach going into the community. Is that not race-based policies? It's not race-based policies if you want to do outreach.
Ms Sepuloni was not having a bar of it.
This is probably the thing I've been most disappointed about the whole way through this campaign is the attack on simple equity measures like this. This is not about giving Māori and Pacific any advantage, because we are disadvantaged given our health outcomes and our lack of access to the health system.
And then there's crime, where there was plenty of disagreement when National's boot camps policy was discussed.
We do have policies around military academies where they are going to have wraparound support. No, they do work. There'll be wraparound support, there'll be coaches in the community. You cannot put them back into the same environment where they haven't learnt anything. You're not giving that 10-year-old, 12-year-old a chance to change their life around before they get those to types of boot camps. No, that's incorrect. Yeah. But anyway.
While the parties disagreed on most things, something they couldn't argue with was the stats. One of the drivers of poor health is housing conditions. 40% of our Pacific people live in overcrowded homes. 1 in 10 Pacific children live in damp and mouldy homes, where they are 80 times more likely to develop acute rheumatic fever, which can lead to heart disease and death. ACT wants to make building homes easier.
And you talk to some community organisations and they may have the funding, they may be able to actually build those homes, but actually getting the consent process and going through all that rigmarole can actually take longer than building the homes.
The Greens want more support for renters.
It's like mushrooms growing on the floor, broken windows, all of this,
cheaper rent,
all of this kind of carry on. But it's not acceptable.
With all parties claiming they have the answers, it's now up to the more than 8% of Pasifika voters who contribute around $8 billion to the country each year to decide for themselves.
The safety of politicians is in the spotlight in Australia after the Northern Territory Chief Minister Natasha Fyles was attacked with a pancake over the weekend. Experts say it points to a worrying trend of increasing threats and violence against elected representatives. The ABC's Flint Duxfield has the story.
NT Chief Minister Natasha Fyles was out at a popular Darwin market yesterday morning when a woman approached her and pushed what's being described as a cream pancake into her face.
Obviously, I was quite shocked after it happened, but, it certainly was a fair whack.
The Chief Minister told local FM radio station Mix 104.9 she's now got a black eye as a result of the attack.
I'm in a bit of pain, but it's okay. I'll get on with it. But it's just not acceptable. Violence is never acceptable, and especially just out in the community at a community event. I don't care if you try and dress it up by throwing a crate. She gave me a fair shove, and it's not acceptable.
A woman in her 50s has been charged with aggravated assault related to the incident. The Northern Territory's Police Commissioner Michael Murphy is considering ramping up protection for Ms Fyles and for members of her cabinet. It comes after an incident in May this year when the Chief Minister was harassed by anti-fracking protesters while competing in a running competition in Central Australia. It's the latest in a number of attacks against politicians in recent years as they go about their jobs. In 2019, Queensland Senator Fraser Anning had an egg smashed on his head during a press conference in Melbourne.
People are getting attacked in their own...
And while she was Prime Minister, Julia Gillard had sandwiches thrown at her on 2 separate occasions.
Prime Minister, are you disappointed that on another school visit you've had another sandwich thrown at you?
Oh, I think I must have thought I was hungry.
While the incidents can sometimes be laughed off as pranks, those who study extremist movements say they need to be taken seriously. Dr Kaz Ross is an independent researcher into far-right movements and conspiracies.
People think, oh, that's hilarious. It's, it's only a pie. It doesn't matter. But I think that what we're seeing is in recent years a really serious trend towards actual physical harm. If you look at, for example, the UK, where politicians have been killed, then you know that throwing something, even if it's only a pie, is not at all innocent. It's very concerning.
Federal police say there's been an increase in reports of direct threats to MPs since about 2017, but the numbers have tripled in the past 3 years. Dr Ross believes conspiracy theories surrounding the pandemic played a crucial role.
Right, let's get to some of your feedback now on our conversation with Sir John Key and Christopher Luxon saying he'd work with Winston Peters. This listener says, great to hear Chris Luxon is open to working with our most experienced politician. Winston was an excellent foreign minister and mentor to Jacinda. On the other side of the coin, AJ's got in touch and said, hi Lisa, I'd take a second election over Winston Peters any day. To be honest, it'd probably increase the power of my own vote, so I'm sort of hoping it happens now. And Paul says, oh no, we'll wait for Paul.
RNZ News at 6 o'clock. Tēnā tātou, ko Evie Ashton tēnei. Former Prime Minister Sir John Key believes National's decision to work with Winston Peters is simply a race to 61 seats. Party leader Christopher Luxon says he will bring the New Zealand First Leader to form a government with them and the ACT Party if needed. Sir John ruled Mr Peters out as a coalition partner at 2 elections when he was National's leader. He has told Checkpoint Mr Peters could hold all the power.
If you've ruled him out in the way that Chris Hipkins has, and you've told the public, I will not deal with them, which is exactly my position in 2008. I would not have Winston. I would assume that Chris Hipkins is a man of his word and won't ring. Well, then how do you form a government? It's got to be a minority government on that basis.
Recent polls have New Zealand First reaching the 5% threshold needed to get back into Parliament. The Green Party says it welcomes the release of a climate manifesto from Labour, but it's largely restating the existing work programme. Labour says it would commit to a second emissions reduction plan, put more money into the Green Investment Fund and establish a Minister for Just Transitions to oversee the transition to a low emissions economy. The Greens co-leader James Shaw says his party and Labour are clearly on the same page about the need to cut emissions, but things need to be scaled up and done faster.
Well, I would like to see every political party competing on how they're going to not just hit the current targets, but also ensure that we go beyond those, because we know that we need to dramatically cut the amount of pollution that's going into the atmosphere, and we know that we really need to scale up our efforts to defend ourselves from these floods and storms.
James Shaw says just transition has been an area without enough traction, and Labour's policy to create a dedicated minister is useful. Civil Defence teams in Gisborne say the rain is easing, although it's expected to continue through until 11 o'clock tonight. An orange heavy rain warning remains in place for the area north of the city until then, with a further 150 millimetres of rain expected at most, on top of the more than 200 accumulated in the past 24 hours. Uawa Civil Defence in Tolaga Bay says its team is standing down with no reports of extensive flooding or road damage in their area. Tairāwhiti Civil Defence says it's had reports of surface flooding, and they will continue to monitor river levels, which are expected to peak late this evening. Meanwhile, Bay of Plenty Emergency Management says its infrastructure is holding strong under heavy rain. Group Controller Cara Gordon says all the roads are still open and any flooding has been minor. Waka Kotahi says the closure of a critical highway between the West Coast and Otago should end tomorrow. Muddy Creek Bridge on State Highway 6 north of Makarora has been swamped in a slip, leaving the bridge and road buried in about 20,000 cubic metres of debris. Waka Kotahi is working to partially reopen it. Systems manager Robert Chavot has told Checkpoint there'll be one last check before that happens.
12 p.m. Will be the first round tomorrow, starting at the Lake Hawea side, letting that side through first, and then once convoy reaches the other side, they'll turn around and let the West Coast side through, and then again at 4:30 p.m. tomorrow, weather permitting and conditions permitting.
Robert Chavot says only light vehicles will be allowed through initially, with camper vans being the heaviest types of vehicles permitted. Queenstown Lakes District Council says water tankers are providing safe drinking water across the town centre while the local supply is under a boil water notice. It's been a week since the precautionary notice was issued because of a gastro-illness outbreak stemming from the Cryptosporidium parasite. There have been 31 confirmed cases so far, and the source is still under investigation. The council says in addition to boiling the water, Earnslaw Park has a water bottle refill station. 2 large tankers are at Athol Park and 2 more are in Frankton at the events centre. It says people need to bring their own refillable containers. Soldiers are being put on standby to help police in London after dozens of Metropolitan Firearms officers handed back their permits to carry weapons. Police firearms officers began surrendering their weapons permits after a marksman was charged with the murder of an unarmed man, raising fears about possible future prosecutions. The BBC's Ellie Price is outside the police headquarters.
The Met Police has been keen to stress that military personnel will not be involved in armed patrols across the streets of London. That work will be done by police officers, the majority of which I'm told will be from the Met, so their numbers will be bulked out with officers from other forces from across the country. It's understood, though, that some officers from those other forces have refused to work in the capital in solidarity with their Met colleagues.
And the driver of a left-hand drive American-made car says he was pulled over for a routine breath test, only for the officer to breathalyse his passenger. TJ Woodrow says he and his friends were stopped 3 times this weekend while attending the Alexandra Blossom Festival in his 1964 Impala. Twice the police cottoned on, but Mr Woodrow says the 3rd time, just outside Cromwell, the officer never noticed who was actually behind the wheel. He thinks the repetitive nature of checkpoint testing may have sent the officer into a sort of trance. That's the news.
Pacific Waves.
Bringing Kiribati back into the forum.
Diving into the big stories of the region.
They are an instrument of the Constitution of Fiji.
and shining a light on issues affecting Pacific peoples in Aotearoa and around the world.
Being able to go out into different places and areas that share special connections with our community was really special.
We tala noa to Pacific leaders, newsmakers, experts and commentators, and bring you up-to-date coverage from our dedicated RNZ Pacific team and talented correspondents on the ground in the region. Pacific Waves at 8:15 weeknights on RNZ National.
You are back on Checkpoint next with Lisa Owen. Right now, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Tuesday. For Northland, isolated showers becoming widespread for a time tomorrow. Auckland to Taumarunui and the Central High Country. Periods of rain turning to showers early tomorrow, then easing late. Coromandel, Bay of Plenty, Gisborne and Hawke's Bay. Rain with heavy falls, easing to isolated showers overnight. Some showers possibly heavy about Hawke's Bay tomorrow afternoon and evening with thunderstorms. Taranaki to Kapiti, scattered rain. Wellington and Wairarapa, showers turning to rain tomorrow and gale southerlies developing. Marlborough, North and Mid-Canterbury. Mostly cloudy today with isolated showers. Rain developing about Marlborough tomorrow morning, then spreading to Canterbury later. For Nelson, Buller, Westland and Fiordland, also South Canterbury, Otago and Southland. Mostly fine, apart from areas of low cloud in Southland tomorrow morning. Scattered rain developing about Nelson tomorrow evening. And for Rekohu, Chatham Islands, rain developing this evening. The time is coming up to 8 minutes past 6. I will have news headlines for you at 6:30.
Kia ora rā e ho. No mai, hoki mai. This is Checkpoint, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. National leader Christopher Luxon will need New Zealand first if tonight's News Hub Reid Research poll is anything to go by. National has also dropped 2% to 39.1 since the last Reid Research poll on September 11. 2 weeks on, Labour is down to a woeful 26.5%. ACT is on 8.8%, down 1.3%. The Greens are on 14.2%, up 1.9%, and Te Pāti Māori on 2.2%. But New Zealand First continues to crack the 5% threshold. They're on 5.2%. On those numbers, National would bring 49 MPs to Parliament and ACT 11. With only 60 seats, Christopher Luxon would need New Zealand First's support to form a government. Our political editor, Jane Patterson, joins us now. Wow, Jane, this is interesting on a day when Christopher Luxon said he would pick up the phone to Winston Peters. Does that just show he made a smart move?
Well, it was either pretty prescient of Chris Luxon or they, like others, had been seeing that slow but gradual increase in support for New Zealand First. They've really been creeping up in the polls in the last month or so, registering at about 4.5 in the RNZ poll of polls. But as I said, we look at the trends. It's been slow but steady upwards for New Zealand First, and here we see them cracking that 5% threshold. And not only that, in this poll, it shows also that despite National still having a commanding lead, it would still need ACT and New Zealand First to form a government. Okay, so in some ways, could it be a misstep giving Winston Peters oxygen, saying that you're prepared to lift up the phone and give him a call? Well, Christopher Luxon's position on New Zealand First hadn't been doing the polling, New Zealand First polling too badly, even his position refusing to rule him in or out, which of course kept that option open. That didn't do New Zealand First any harm, so I don't think that the decision today would have had too much influence in terms of reversing that tide of support for New Zealand First. I mean, people supporting them are not going to be voting for Labour. Their votes are not a vote to keep the incumbent government where it is. So I think there's another constituent support driving that vote for New Zealand First, and they're not necessarily always going to listen to what the National Party leader has to say. So ACT is down 8.8%, back into the single digits. Do we think this is a hangover, in part, from the ACT leader David Seymour floating this unusual idea about not giving National supply in an arrangement, in a coalition arrangement? It certainly could have raised questions among right-leaning voters about what that kind of government would look like if National, as has been stated, would prefer a full coalition with ACT, and then ACT making those noises about if it didn't really get exactly what it wanted or proportionately in its view, then it would consider making National go vote by vote. David Seymour has really backed off that in terms of putting his preference out there, saying of course that his preference would be with National in a full coalition. That option is only in their back pocket if they really needed it. So really wanting to make the point last week in particular that that was not their preferred option and that they weren't just throwing the toys out of their cot. The other thing that happened last week were those two debates. So we had the head-to-head with Chris Luxon and Chris Hipkins, and then we had that News Hub, quote, power brokers debate where we saw David Seymour and Winston Peters on the same stage. And I think it was dawning on them, and even at that point, that they needed to be showing that they could be constructive working partners, even though they had maybe different ways of showing it that night.
Interestingly, the Greens are up and almost 2 points, so they'd be pleased with that. But the problem is they don't have enough partners on the left to make the numbers for government.
That's right. So the advantage for the Greens is they come back on these numbers in an opposition, and that is the way the trends are shaping up, that, you know, in many polls now, Labour and the Greens and Party Māori don't have the numbers to form a government. So they'll be looking at a strengthened caucus, which does help in terms of resourcing, in terms of number and heft, even in opposition. But really, unless they have a very strong Labour Party, it's not going to advantage them in terms of a path to government. And of course, it's always a bit of a double-edged sword when you see on sometimes National and ACT is strong when National is weak, and in this case, heading into lessened popularity for Labour, we see the Greens picking up. And you can see some of the left-leaning voters, disillusioned with maybe the path that Chris Hipkins has taken, marching towards the centre to fight National, that wealth tax, the capital gains tax, maybe some other areas of record, but they just are still not with Labour, so they're opting for the Greens. So benefiting, I think, from Labour's drop in popularity. But as I said, zero-sum game on the left if those votes are just moving between Labour and the Greens.
Some would argue Chris Hipkins' bonfire of Labour policies was a mistake. Could it also be said that strategically, by ruling Winston out, he has backed himself into a corner? Winston on the polls seems to be on an upward trend. At the moment, combined, Greens, Te Pāti Māori, New Zealand First and Labour are one short of getting a majority, but there's no saying that Winston Peters couldn't go higher.
I think coming back to the start of the year when Chris Hipkins signalled a big change in direction from Jacinda Ardern, there was a receptive response from the public. I do think there was a view that Labour had gone too far and overextended itself, and they probably wanted the government to trim its cloth a little bit and come back to the centre. As I said, there were some decisions, and I think capital gains tax and wealth tax will always be one that you can debate about how much loss that caused for Labour. I think more damaging was that run of ministerial scandals. You just had Chris Hipkins for the month on month dealing with controversies. I think that really chipped away at the cumulative view of Labour in terms of competence, and also just the calibre of the ministerial lineup at that point, and Chris Hipkins as leader. Remember too, Winston Peters ruled out Labour before Chris Hipkins made that decision, and that was quite unusual for Winston Peters to actually be laying it out in black and white. So I don't really think Chris Hipkins had the choice. He says now on a matter of principle that Labour wouldn't work with New Zealand First, but really that choice was taken away from him. Whether he'd still have that position if having Winston Peters in the lineup would make it possible for Labour, who knows? That's going to be part of the election 2023 hindsight, I'm sure.
I want to circle back to ACT. We talked about the fact that they'd dropped off, and potentially there was obviously David Seymour floating various coalition arrangements. And as you say, we saw them head-to-head, David Seymour and Winston Peters, in that debate. Christopher Luxon's comments today about New Zealand First and his willingness to work with them if he has to, is that a warning to ACT as well in terms of what they could potentially demand and expect from a coalition?
I don't think it's so much a warning to ACT. I do think it is more a message to voters in terms of Christopher Luxon saying, here's who I'm willing to work with. I haven't ruled it out, but here I'm going to say it in black and white, because realistically he needs to keep those options open. I think if you were looking at it in terms of the language, Christopher Luxon was very keen to say our preferred option is with ACT, but underneath all of that, and what you were really hearing Chris Luxon push last week when people were maybe starting to look at what influence ACT may or may not have, was party vote national. This is the message that he is now drumming home. Actually, don't worry about ACT, don't worry about New Zealand first. If you want to change the government, that's what you need to do. And of course, this is a message that we've heard from other prime ministers like John Key, and reiterating that actually you can look at the polls, but we often have very, very close, tight elections, and that is what Chris Luxon is now positioning for, a potentially very tight race, but saying to his supporters, don't take anything for granted. If you want a government led from the right, then you have to vote for us. That's obviously what Chris Luxon's message is saying, and ACT and New Zealand First now are having to position themselves within that to make sure that they are being seen as potentially constructive partners so that they too can stay in the mix. But I'm sure that poll drop for David Seymour would be worrying. They've had a very strong showing through the term. The campaign has seen them really drop off in some polls, and as I said, they had controversy around some of their candidates. They had a run of candidates having to step down. So his musings about the confidence only thing haven't been the only problem for ACT this campaign.
Jane, before you go, 24% for Christopher Luxon in the preferred Prime Minister stakes, 19.1% for Christopher Hipkins. So Luxon is pulling away from him in the preferred Prime Minister stakes.
That's right. Chris Hipkins really starting to bottom out in these preferred Prime Minister polls. If you remember, and a lot of the polls, they had been sort of neck and neck, although still rating very low for the leaders of the two main parties. They had at least been a bit more equal. So maybe we're starting to see some of the flow on from those debates, seeing the two men up beside each other debating head to head. Maybe that's starting to flow on. There weren't really any massive controversies either side in terms of being out on the campaign trail. So again, maybe that view of voters beginning to solidify, and Chris Luxon is the benefactor of this particular one.
Interesting stuff, Jane. Thank you for that. That is our political editor, Jane Patterson. Queenstown is fighting fires on a couple of fronts as it cleans up from a state of emergency and deals with a cryptosporidium outbreak. As well as that, the resort town is still dealing with a severe shortage of accommodation. A growing number of residents are sleeping in cars and tents, and more than 1,000 households are waiting for housing support in the district. Many of these people have a regular job but just can't find somewhere to live. Our reporter Jimmy Ellingham and cameraman Nick Monroe visited some of those struggling to get a roof over their head.
On the shore of Lake Waka Kotahi, a tent tucked behind a bush contains everything that Paula Martin owns in this world.
It's rough. It's no access to showers. It's just a toilet, and you can't drink the water. I got to get water from town. It's rough and it's wearing me down. It's affecting my mental health and it's affecting my physical health. I've just been doing it for too long and it's taking a toll. Yeah.
Paula works as a cleaner, but due to the shortage of accommodation, she hasn't been able to find a suitable rental.
18 months in a tent. Been looking for a place to live, but as I'm older and I work nights, I find it really difficult to find anywhere.
And Paula's not the only Queenstown resident living at the 12-mile Delta campsite.
I've got a comfortable bed. I got 2 layers of tent just to help insulate things a bit from the cold and the heat.
And you can get warm enough in the winter, you can sleep okay?
Yeah, it's manageable. It's the summers that are really hard.
One of the founders of the Queenstown Housing Initiative, Hannah Sullivan, says cases like Paula's demonstrate why action is needed now. She started the initiative as a voice for people who are houseless, as distinct to being homeless. She says houselessness has its own particular issues. She shows us the facilities available at the camp.
In the evening, there's no lights or anything like that, so it's a very, very, very dark space. There's running water, but you can't drink the water here either. And so yeah, it's just this one very basic facility that is in use for the whole larger area.
The Housing Initiative has also been supporting a family of 5 who arrived in Queenstown for the parents' work, only to find their rental had fallen through at the last minute.
These children were living in a tent and going to school. It was just really sad to see. And all I could do was come and give them little chocolate bars and bring soup when I made some.
After a long and difficult search, Kingston Ortony finally found a place to live.
We struggled for a good while. It was just lucky that one of our mates, his missus, was our property manager, so we got in there that way.
Also, it's knowing someone, right?
Yeah. You need to know someone, Russ? Man, it was hard. Yeah, and they don't. Quite a lot of people don't want the young fellas or whatever in their houses. They think they'll just piss up, but it's all right.
Queenstown Lakes Community Housing Trust Chief Executive Julie Scott says there are 1,048 households, that's households rather than individuals, on its housing waiting lists. And there are few Kāinga order houses in the region.
Historically, it used to go up by around 100 households per annum, but more recently, some months we've seen 100 registrations online in just 1 month.
She has hopes that a 5-year action plan that includes government organisations will make a difference.
Pre-COVID, there was huge housing stress in terms of, particularly on the rental property market. And then obviously we had COVID, rents went back probably by around 30%, and it was quite achievable, and there's plenty of availability out there. But now what we've seen, we're back up at pre-COVID numbers.
For now, Paula Martin faces summer in her tent.
The winters are manageable. I mean, it's cold, but you can put extra layers on or whatever. It's the summers that are really hard. The sun gets up at like 6 o'clock and it's in the tent, it's really hot, which makes it hard when you're working nights.
Paula remains hopeful the situation in her hometown of 23 years will improve.
And if you were listening to that on radio, you can check out the video version of that story. We'll put it on our web page. 22 minutes after 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. A capsule containing asteroid samples, which scientists hope could explain how life on Earth began, has successfully landed in the United States. A NASA spacecraft dropped the canister carrying just 250 grams of rock and dust from the surface of the asteroid onto the US state of Utah. The BBC's Rebecca Morrell reports.
The SRC has entered the Earth's atmosphere. UTTR tracking acid.
A first glimpse of the capsule after its epic journey through space.
We have confirmed parachute deployment.
High up in the atmosphere, a parachute opens, slowing its descent.
Touchdown. I repeat, DDL. SRC has touchdown.
A textbook landing in the middle of the Utah desert. For the team who've spent decades working on the OSIRIS-REx mission, it's an emotional moment.
So how did it go?
It went absolutely perfectly. Absolutely perfect landing. We stuck it. We didn't move. We landed in nice soft soil. The capsule looked flawless. I cried like a baby in that helicopter when I heard that the parachute had opened and we were coming in for a soft landing. It was just an overwhelming moment for me.
Inside this capsule is the most precious sample. Fragments of an asteroid called Bennu that could reveal the story of our solar system. The team quickly secures the craft to prevent any contamination and attach it to a 30-metre line slung beneath a helicopter. This is the moment that NASA has been waiting for. After 7 long years, travelling billions of miles to Bennu and back, the capsule is finally here. The priority now is getting it out of the dusty desert environment and into the safe and sterile clean room as quickly as possible. A quick knock to say they've arrived and the capsule is in. The painstaking and meticulous process begins. They need to remove the layers like a Russian doll to get to the dust and rocks inside. The whole procedure will take weeks.
Portable clean room?
So why all this effort? Bennu tops the list of NASA's most hazardous space rocks, so studying its makeup could help us to stop it if we ever need to. But it could also reveal more about our origins. It's a perfectly preserved relic from the dawn of the solar system. It's going to keep scientists busy for a long time.
One of the most important parts of a sample return mission is we take 75% of that sample and we're going to lock it away for future generations, people who haven't even been born yet. to work in laboratories that don't exist yet, and instrumentation that you haven't thought of yet. So, I mean, it's an incredibly valuable sample that we're bringing back.
Scientists think they have a treasure trove on their hands, one that includes extraterrestrial material unlike anything we've seen on Earth before.
In Perth, Poppy and Michael were born on the same day to the same mother from the same womb, but they're not your average twins. Poppy is a little bigger than her brother and looks to be older than him. And though she was born on the same day, Poppy is biologically a little older, 18 days to be precise. So how could this be? The ABC's Veronica Buck has the story.
So we have been called a medical miracle because it just shouldn't have happened, really.
Oh, you're warming up now, are you?
Yeah, we were waiting for this.
So Sandra gets pregnant. Yay! 18 days later, gets pregnant again with twins with different due dates.
My husband and I just sat there in silence because we didn't really understand what was going on.
Bit of disbelief, I guess. I just knew that it was going to be a lot of explaining to people how it happened.
After passing routine health checks and getting what she thought was her period, Sandra started an IVF cycle without realising she'd already gotten pregnant naturally.
They were telling me that potentially we'd had sex during the cycle, and I said no.
First blood test, her hormone levels for the pregnancy were sky high, really abnormally so. So we got an early scan which showed a 7 or 8 week sized fetus, which was about 18 days ahead of where it should have been, plus another little sac which was consistent with our really early pregnancy from the IVF cycle.
So when she was born, Poppy here was considered full term. Michael was prem, and they had different developmental milestones.
Firstly in size, so Michael was 2 kilos and Poppy was 3 kilos. So Michael hadn't quite developed the sucking reflex, whereas Poppy was able to feed straight away.
For obvious reasons, they had to be born the same day, but picking a date was tricky. Known as superfetation twins, they are crazy rare. There's only about 10 confirmed cases of them in the world.
Superfetation twins are when there's 2 different pregnancies that have been conceived at different times within the same uterus. There's likely to be some extra cases out there that are underreported and we just don't know about.
There's even been cases of 1 pregnancy with 2 biological fathers.
There are cases reported where people have ovulated spontaneously days apart and you have a superfecundation there. That's rarer than the case we're talking about with the IVF.
You'd think medical experts would want to write papers about them. They've already asked.
It's always interesting to document these because they're so rare that, there'll be a few cases in the literature, but not many. So it's nice to, it's interesting for other doctors to see that these rare things can happen.
The couple froze sperm after David was diagnosed with testicular cancer in 2015 and had chemo. Sandra then discovered she had a low egg count. With 2 children already from that fertility journey, this was to be their last IVF attempt to implant their final frozen embryo.
She's a very lucky lady to get 2 beautiful babies after such a rare event.
The reason why we wanted to share it is that it is a good news story. It's been like a happy accident.
We could have the family that we dreamed of, but we've got a bit more than we bargained for, but I'm not complaining.
Alrighty, that's us for the night. Ko te kaupapa tuatahi a pōpō tomorrow from 5 a.m. First up is in Christopher Luxon's Botany Electorate to ask voters what they think of New Zealand First potentially joining National in government. Well, I tell you one thing, that conversation will not be boring. Set your alarm, put the toaster on and brew some coffee. Catch them at 5 a.m. tomorrow and we'll be with you a little later in the day. Have a great night.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Tēnā tātou, I'm Evie Ashton. National and ACT would require New Zealand First to form a government, according to the latest News Hub Reid Research poll. It puts National 1.8 points down to 39.1%, while ACT has also fallen